Sarah Mitchell stood at her bedroom window, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the Denver skyline in hues of orange and purple. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, their snow-capped peaks a constant reminder of nature's grandeur. But for Sarah, even the most beautiful sunset couldn't fill the void in her heart. 3 years had passed since she'd lost her husband, yet the emptiness in their Cherry Creek home seemed to grow with each passing day. The sound of her phone buzzing pulled her from her thoughts. It was her sister, Rachel Henderson, calling for their daily check-in. "Have you thought about what we discussed?" Rachel's voice was gentle but insistent. "The Animal Shelter Volunteer Program?" Sarah sighed, running her fingers through her auburn hair. At 42, she wasn't ready to admit that she needed help moving forward, but Rachel's persistence was wearing her down. "I'll think about it," she replied, knowing full well her sister wouldn't let it go. The next morning, more to appease Rachel than anything else, Sarah found herself pulling into the Denver Animal Rescue Center's parking lot. The modern facility stood in stark contrast to the industrial buildings surrounding it, its cheerful blue and white exterior almost too bright for her mood. Inside, she was greeted by Lisa Cooper, a perpetually smiling volunteer coordinator with kind eyes and graying hair. "First time here?" Lisa asked, leading Sarah through the facility. The walls were covered with success stories, photos of happy families with their adopted pets. "Yes," Sarah admitted, trying to match Lisa's enthusiasm. "My sister thinks it might be therapeutic." The word felt strange in her mouth, almost bitter. As they walked through the dog section, most of the animals bounded to the front of their kennels, tails wagging and barking excitedly. But one dog caught Sarah's attention precisely because he wasn't making any noise at all. In the last kennel, a magnificent Doberman sat perfectly still, his dark eyes following their movement with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "That's Max," Lisa explained, noticing Sarah's interest. "He's been here for about 2 weeks. Someone found him wandering near City Park, no collar, no chip. He's perfectly trained, healthy, and surprisingly gentle for his breed, but something about him." She trailed off, shaking her head. Sarah moved closer to the kennel. Max stood up, his movement fluid and graceful. He approached the gate with a dignity that seemed almost regal, maintaining eye contact with Sarah the entire time. There was something in those eyes. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of understanding that resonated with her own loss. "Can I?" Sarah gestured toward the kennel door. Lisa hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Of course, we can use the meet and greet room." In the private room, Max sat perfectly at attention, waiting for something. Sarah knelt down to his level, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt a spark of connection. When she reached out her hand, Max gently pressed his muzzle against her palm, and Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "He's usually quite reserved with visitors," Lisa commented from the doorway, surprise evident in her voice. "This is the first time I've seen him respond so quickly to someone." Sarah barely heard her. She was lost in Max's gaze, feeling as though she'd found something she didn't even know she was missing. The Doberman's presence felt somehow familiar and safe, like coming home after a long journey. 2 hours later, Sarah was filling out adoption papers, her hands trembling slightly as she signed her name. Lisa provided her with a basic supplies starter kit, though Sarah had already made a mental list of everything she'd need to pick up from the pet store. "There's something special about him," Lisa said, as she helped Sarah attach a new leather leash to Max's collar. "I can't quite put my finger on it, but, well, sometimes the right dog finds the right person." As Sarah led Max to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an adoption. The way Max moved beside her, perfectly in step, occasionally glancing up as if checking on her, it felt like the beginning of something important. Back home, Max explored the house with methodical precision, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. He paused at each window, each door as if making mental notes. When he finally settled in the living room, it was in a spot that gave him a clear view of both the front door and Sarah's favorite reading chair. That night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she realized she hadn't thought about her loss all afternoon. Instead, her mind was filled with plans: morning walks in Cherry Creek Park, training sessions, maybe even joining that dog-friendly hiking group Rachel had mentioned months ago. For the first time in years, Sarah felt something like hope stirring in her chest. As she turned out the lights, she heard Max settle on the dog bed she'd placed in the corner of her room. His presence was comforting, solid, real. "Good night, Max," she whispered into the darkness. The Doberman's tail thumped once against the floor in response, a quiet acknowledgement of their new beginning. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Max fell into a comfortable routine. Their days started with morning walks through Cherry Creek's tree-lined streets, where Max's impeccable leash manners drew admiring glances from other dog owners. In the evenings, they would take longer walks, exploring different parts of the neighborhood as the summer sun lingered in the Colorado sky. What struck Sarah most was Max's extraordinary awareness of their surroundings. He seemed to anticipate which route she would choose before she made the turn, and his attention never wavered, even during their longest walks. There was a precision to his movements that she couldn't quite explain, as if every step was carefully calculated. One evening, Sarah's neighbor, Eleanor Wright, stopped them during their walk. Eleanor was in her 70s, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in Cherry Creek for decades. "Your dog," she said, watching Max with curious eyes. "He reminds me of the police dogs I used to see at school demonstrations. Same alertness, same bearing." Sarah looked down at Max, who sat perfectly at her side, his posture indeed reminiscent of a trained service animal. "He came from the shelter," she explained, "but you're right, he does seem to have had some special training." As they continued their walk, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to Max's behaviors. The way he positioned himself between her and approaching strangers, how he scanned each intersection before they crossed, his tendency to circle back to check on her if she paused for too long. It all spoke of more than just good training. At home, Max's protective instincts became even more apparent. He developed a routine of checking the house before settling down for the night, moving from room to room with purpose. Sarah began to wonder about his past, about who had invested so much time in training him, and why such a valuable dog had ended up at a shelter. One Saturday morning, Sarah decided to try something different. She took Max to Cherry Creek Park's dog area, curious to see how he would interact with other dogs. As soon as they entered the enclosure, the difference between Max and the other dogs became stark. While other dogs played and chased each other, Max stayed close to Sarah, his attention divided between her and their surroundings. "Remarkable dog you've got there," a man's voice said behind her. Sarah turned to find a tall, athletic-looking man watching Max with obvious interest. "I'm James Morrison, by the way. I work with service dogs." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, shaking his offered hand. "And this is Max. He's a rescue, but you suspect he's had professional training," James finished for her. He knelt down, not reaching for Max, but allowing the dog to observe him. Max's response was curious. He maintained his position by Sarah's side, but showed no signs of anxiety or aggression. "The way he carries himself, his attention patterns, those aren't things you typically see in civilian dogs," James continued. "Mind if I try something?" At Sarah's nod, James stood and moved several paces away. Then, in a clear, commanding voice, he called out what sounded like a German phrase. Max's head snapped up, his ears forward, but he didn't move from Sarah's side. James's eyebrows rose. "Interesting. He recognizes professional commands but won't respond to them without your approval. That's high-level training." Sarah felt a mix of pride and uncertainty. "Should I be concerned?" "About his past, I mean?" James shook his head. "Whatever his background, it's clear he's bonded with you now. That kind of loyalty is rare and valuable." He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "I train service dogs for veterans. If you ever want to learn more about working with Max's abilities, give me a call." On their walk home, Sarah found herself studying Max with new eyes. Who was this dog, really? What circumstances had brought him to that shelter, and by extension into her life? As if sensing her thoughts, Max looked up at her, his dark eyes full of that same understanding she'd noticed the day they met. That evening, as they sat in the backyard watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant Colorado colors, Sarah realized something had shifted in her life. The crushing loneliness that had been her constant companion for 3 years had lifted, replaced by something else: curiosity, purpose, maybe even adventure. Max lay at her feet, alert as always, but relaxed in their shared space. Whatever his past might be, whatever training or circumstances had shaped him, he was here now, with her. And somehow, that felt like exactly where they both needed to be. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow she would call James Morrison. If Max had special abilities, she wanted to understand them to help him use them. Something told her this was just the beginning of their story. Inside, as she prepared for bed, Sarah heard Max doing his usual security sweep of the house. But now, knowing what she knew, the sound of his methodical movements brought her comfort rather than questions. She had always felt safe with Max, and now she understood why. "We've both got secrets, don't we, boy?" she whispered as Max finally settled into his bed. His only response was a soft sigh, but Sarah could have sworn she saw something like acknowledgement in his eyes before they closed. The late summer heat wave had hit Denver hard, forcing Sarah and Max to adjust their walking schedule to the cooler evening hours. After her conversation with James Morrison at the dog park, Sarah had spent several days contemplating whether to call him. Something about Max's past both intrigued and unsettled her, like a puzzle missing crucial pieces. One particularly humid evening, as they walked through their usual route in Cherry Creek, Sarah noticed Max's behavior shift. His ears perked forward, body tensing slightly as they approached the corner of Madison Street. Ahead of them, a police cruiser was parked outside the local coffee shop, its lights off but engine running. As they drew closer, Sarah saw an officer step out of the shop carrying 2 cups of coffee. The moment the officer's eyes landed on Max, he froze. The coffee cup slipped from his hands, splashing across the sidewalk. Max's reaction was equally telling. He had stopped dead in his tracks, his posture alert but not aggressive. "Impossible," the officer muttered, taking a step forward. "Maximus?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. No one at the shelter had known Max's full name, yet this officer had spoken it with such certainty. Max's tail gave a single subtle wag, but he remained firmly by Sarah's side. The officer composed himself quickly, straightening his nameplate that read, "Officer Michael Bennett." "I'm sorry about that," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Your dog? He looks exactly like a K9 unit I used to know." Sarah's mind raced back to James Morrison's observations about Max's training. "Used to know?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Officer Bennett's expression clouded. "Yeah, about 3 years ago. Best dog in the unit." He paused, studying Max intently. "But this can't be him. That dog was—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Sarah felt Max press slightly against her leg, a gesture she'd come to recognize as his way of offering support. "I adopted him from the Denver Animal Rescue Center a few months ago," she offered, watching the officer's reaction carefully. Bennett's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise. "Is that right? Well, he's a beautiful dog. You're lucky to have found each other." His tone was pleasant, but Sarah caught the way his eyes kept darting to Max, the slight tremor in his hands as he cleaned up the spilled coffee. As they walked away, Sarah could feel Officer Bennett's gaze following them. Max maintained his perfect heel position, but there was a new tension in his stride. Sarah's mind was churning with questions. The way the officer had reacted, the name Maximus, it couldn't be coincidence. Back home, Sarah pulled out James Morrison's business card. Her fingers hovered over her phone's keypad before she finally dialed the number. It rang twice before his warm voice answered. "Mr. Morrison. This is Sarah Mitchell from the dog park. Something happened tonight that I think you should know about." They agreed to meet the following morning at a small cafe near the park. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she could hear Max's restless movements downstairs. For the first time since his adoption, he hadn't settled easily into his nighttime routine. "What happened to you, Max?" she whispered into the darkness. "What made you disappear from the force?" The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the heat wave finally breaking. Sarah dressed carefully, choosing comfortable clothes for what she suspected might be a long conversation. Max watched her preparations with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than a dog should. When they arrived at the cafe, James Morrison was already there, seated at an outdoor table with a manila folder in front of him. His expression was serious as he watched them approach. "I did some checking after we met," he said without preamble. "Called in a few favors with contacts in various K9 units. Your Max's markings are quite distinctive, and there aren't many Dobermans with his level of training in the region." Sarah sat down, her heart pounding. Max settled at her feet, but she noticed his eyes were fixed on the folder on the table. "What did you find out?" she asked, not entirely sure she was ready for the answer. James glanced around before leaning forward. 3 years ago, the Denver Police Department had a Doberman in their K9 unit. His name was Maximus, and he was something of a legend in law enforcement circles. Specialized in protection, detail, and tracking, he had more successful operations under his belt than any other dog in the unit's history. Sarah's mouth went dry. What happened to him? James opened the folder, revealing a photograph that made Sarah's breath catch. There was Max, proudly wearing a police vest, standing next to a uniformed officer who was definitely not Michael Bennett. That's the interesting part, James said, his voice dropping lower. According to official records, Maximus was lost during a training exercise in the mountains. They searched for weeks, but eventually had to declare him lost in the line of duty. But looking at your Max, he shook his head. The markings are identical, right down to the small white patch on his chest. Sarah reached down to touch Max's head, feeling him lean into her hand. But why would a highly trained police dog end up abandoned in a city park? And if Officer Bennett recognized him tonight, why didn't he say something officially? James's expression grew troubled. That's what concerns me. In my experience, when things don't add up in law enforcement, there's usually a reason. The question is, do you want to know what that reason is? Sarah looked down at Max, who gazed back at her with complete trust. In the months since she'd adopted him, he'd brought purpose back to her life, helped her find strength she didn't know she had. She owed it to him to uncover the truth. Yes, she said firmly. I need to know what happened to him. James nodded, closing the folder. Then we need to be careful how we proceed. If Max is who we think he is, there might be people who don't want his story coming to light. The following week passed in a blur of revelations and growing uncertainty. Sarah had taken James's advice to heart, maintaining her normal routine with Max while quietly gathering information. She'd created a detailed timeline of the events leading up to Max's appearance at the shelter, marking the gaps that needed filling. During their evening walks, she began to notice small changes in their neighborhood. The same police cruiser seemed to appear more frequently on their street. Twice, she spotted Officer Bennett watching them from a distance, though he made no attempt to approach. One morning, Sarah decided to visit the Denver Police Department's Public Records Office. She'd told only James of her plans, leaving Max at home for the first time since his adoption. The separation made her anxious, but she knew bringing him might attract unwanted attention. The records clerk, a young woman named Amy Parker, was surprisingly helpful when Sarah explained she was researching the history of the K9 unit for a community newsletter. "Oh, you should definitely talk to Detective Christina Martinez," Amy said, pulling up some files on her computer. She used to work closely with the K9 division. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was a name that hadn't come up in any of her previous research. "Is she still with the department?" Amy's expression fell slightly. "No, she transferred to the Boulder PD about 2 years ago, but she was here during the golden years of the K9 unit. She actually handled their most famous case, the Richardson evidence that brought down that big corporate fraud scheme." Sarah made a mental note of the case name as Amy continued chattering while pulling up the public record she'd requested. Among the documents was a newspaper article featuring a photograph of the K9 unit from 3 years ago. Sarah's heart nearly stopped when she saw Maximus, standing proudly beside a handler she now recognized as Detective Martinez. That evening, she met James at a small diner on the outskirts of Denver. The place was nearly empty, which suited their need for privacy. Max lay under the table, occasionally lifting his head at the sound of passing trucks. "Christina Martinez," James said thoughtfully, stirring his coffee. "The name rings a bell. She had quite a reputation in law enforcement circles, known for being incorruptible, which didn't always make her popular with her colleagues." Sarah pushed her own cup aside, leaning forward. "The records clerk mentioned something about the Richardson case. Could that be connected to what happened to Max?" James's expression grew serious. The Richardson case was huge. Thomas Richardson was a real estate developer who got caught up in a massive fraud investigation. The evidence that brought him down came from a K9 unit that tracked down crucial documents in an abandoned warehouse. The dog that made that find... He glanced meaningfully at Max. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm evening. So Maximus, and Detective Martinez were the ones who broke the case open. Yes, and shortly after that, things started happening. Martinez was transferred to Boulder, supposedly at her own request. A few months later, Maximus disappeared during that training exercise, and Richardson, James lowered his voice, he walked free on a technicality, though the evidence against him had seemed airtight. As they talked, Sarah noticed a car pass by the diner's window for the third time. Max had noticed too. His ears were forward, body slightly tense. James casually glanced over his shoulder. "Don't react," he said quietly. "But I think we're being watched. We should wrap this up." They left separately, James first, then Sarah and Max a few minutes later. As they drove home, Sarah's mind was racing. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, but it was one that made her increasingly uneasy. Back home, Sarah spent hours on her laptop, researching everything she could find about the Richardson case and Detective Martinez. Max stayed close, more alert than usual, monitoring every sound from outside. Around midnight, her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Found Martinez. She's willing to talk, but not here. Says it has to be in person, in Boulder. Be careful who you tell." Sarah looked down at Max, who gazed back at her with those knowing eyes. They were getting closer to the truth, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were also heading into dangerous territory. The question wasn't just what had happened to Max 3 years ago, but why someone had gone to such lengths to remove both him and Detective Martinez from Denver. As she prepared for bed, Sarah noticed Max's unusual restlessness. He kept moving between windows, his behavior reminiscent of that first night after their encounter with Officer Bennett. She realized that in pursuing the truth about his past, she might be stirring up something that had been deliberately buried. But looking at Max, her loyal, brave, extraordinary companion, she knew she couldn't stop now. Whatever had happened 3 years ago had robbed him of his purpose and position. He deserved to have his story told, his name cleared. Sarah made her decision. Tomorrow she would drive to Boulder to meet Detective Martinez. As she finally settled into bed, Max positioned himself not in his usual spot, but directly beside her bed, clearly on guard. "We're in this together," she whispered, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "Whatever happened to you, we'll figure it out, I promise." Max's tail thumped once against the floor, but his attention remained fixed on the window, watching, waiting, as if he knew that their quiet life in Cherry Creek was about to change dramatically. In the days following their discovery about the Richardson case, Sarah found herself viewing every shadow with suspicion. Even their usual morning walks through Cherry Creek had taken on a different character. Each passing car seemed to linger too long. Every unfamiliar face appeared to watch them with unusual interest. Max's behavior had shifted subtly as well. His already vigilant nature had heightened, his responses more pronounced. During their walks, he would occasionally stop and stare intently at parked cars or specific buildings, particularly ones that Sarah later learned were owned by Richardson's development company. One crisp morning, as they passed the local coffee shop, Sarah noticed Officer Bennett inside, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with 2 men in expensive suits. Max's reaction was immediate. A low, almost imperceptible growl, his body tensing slightly. Through the window, Sarah caught Bennett's eye. The officer quickly looked away, but not before Sarah saw something that looked like guilt flash across his face. "You know something about him, don't you?" Sarah whispered to Max as they continued their walk. His only response was to press closer to her side, his protective instinct more pronounced than usual. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by newspaper clippings she'd collected about the Richardson case. Max lay at her feet, but his ears remained alert, tracking every sound from outside. The articles painted a disturbing picture, a pattern of development projects that always seemed to encounter unexpected difficulties until property owners agreed to sell. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Need to talk. Not on the phone. Meet at the dog park in an hour." The dog park was busy when they arrived, which Sarah suspected was exactly why James had chosen it. They would be less conspicuous among the crowd of dog owners and their pets. Max maintained his usual dignified bearing, but Sarah noticed how he positioned himself to keep both her and their surroundings in view. "Christina's been doing some digging," James said quietly as they walked the perimeter of the park. The timing of Max's disappearance lines up perfectly with a crucial period in the Richardson investigation. The week he vanished, it was just days before a scheduled search of another Richardson property. Sarah watched as Max tracked the movement of a black SUV that had just pulled into the parking lot. You think they knew about what he could find? Christina thinks someone tipped them off. After Max found those documents in the warehouse, Richardson's people realized how dangerous a well-trained search dog could be to their operation, especially one that couldn't be bought or threatened. The SUV's tinted windows reflected the late afternoon sun, making it impossible to see inside. Max had shifted his position slightly, placing himself between Sarah and the vehicle. There's more, James continued, his voice dropping lower. Christina found out that Officer Bennett was assigned to the K9 unit temporarily, just a few weeks before Max's disappearance. His transfer request came from pretty high up the chain of command. Sarah's heart pounded as the pieces started fitting together. He was planted there, looking into it. But we need to be careful. Richardson's influence runs deep in this city. James glanced at the SUV, which still hadn't moved. You're being watched, Sarah, both of you. They know Max recognized Bennett, and they're worried about what else he might remember. As if to confirm James's words, Max's posture suddenly became more alert. Sarah followed his gaze to see Officer Bennett himself, walking through the park's entrance. The moment he spotted them, he changed direction, heading back to his patrol car. We need to move fast, James said, watching Bennett's retreat. Christina's got a contact at the FBI, but they need more evidence before they can act. The problem is Richardson's people know that too. They'll be watching every move you make. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. What should we do? For now, stick to your routine. Don't let them know we're onto them. But we need to put some contingency plans in place. James handed her a small burner phone. Keep this with you. Christina and I are working on finding you a safe place to stay if things get too hot. Max had moved closer to Sarah, his body language communicating both protection and reassurance. Looking down at him, Sarah was struck by the complexity of their situation. What had started as a simple adoption had evolved into something far more dangerous and important. They walked James to his truck, maintaining the appearance of a casual dog park conversation. As they watched him drive away, Sarah noticed the black SUV finally pulling out of the parking lot, moving with deliberate slowness. "Looks like our quiet life is over, boy," she murmured to Max. His response was to scan their surroundings one more time before leading her toward home, his movements precise and protective. That evening, as they sat in their backyard watching the sunset, Sarah found herself studying Max's profile. He was still the gentle companion who had helped her rebuild her life, but now she could clearly see Maximus, the highly trained K9 officer who had uncovered corruption at the highest levels of Denver society. Both aspects of his personality were equally real, equally important. As darkness fell over Cherry Creek, Sarah made a decision. They couldn't run from this. Max had tried to expose the truth once before and had nearly lost everything. She wouldn't let that happen again. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Inside, as she prepared for bed, Sarah heard Max performing his nightly security check of the house with even more thoroughness than usual. Each sound of his movements reminded her that their partnership had evolved into something neither of them could have anticipated. They were no longer just a woman and her rescue dog. They were guardians of a truth that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. The next few days passed in a state of heightened awareness. Sarah found herself jumping at small sounds, watching for unfamiliar cars in the neighborhood, and taking different routes during their daily walks. Max seemed to sense her unease, staying closer than usual and maintaining an even more vigilant watch over their surroundings. Life in Cherry Creek continued its normal rhythm, but Sarah now saw everything through a different lens. The regular patrol cars passing by her house no longer seemed routine. The friendly waves from neighbors carried a hint of question. Did they notice the change in her behavior? Even the local coffee shop, where she and Max often stopped during their morning walks, felt different somehow. James had advised her to maintain her normal routines while being cautious, so Sarah forced herself to go about her usual activities. She was in her front garden, Max lying nearby but alert as always, when Eleanor Wright approached their fence. "Sarah, dear," the elderly neighbor called out, "is everything all right? You seem different lately." Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "I'm fine, Eleanor. Just a bit preoccupied with work." The lie felt heavy on her tongue, but Christina's warnings about discretion rang in her ears. Eleanor's keen eyes studied her face. You know, I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, seen all sorts of things come and go, including people who didn't want to be seen coming and going. She glanced meaningfully at Max. Your boy there reminds me more and more of the police dogs that used to train in the park, back when this neighborhood was still quiet, before all the new money moved in. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? The older woman leaned closer to the fence. Thomas Richardson's first development project was right here in Cherry Creek. Before the fraud allegations, before he became the big shot he is now, some of us remember what happened to the families who wouldn't sell their homes to him. Max had risen to his feet, moving closer to the fence. His posture was relaxed, but Sarah had learned to read his subtle signals. He was paying very close attention to Eleanor's words. The police were always around back then, Eleanor continued. Not to help the residents, mind you. Just to keep the peace while people were being pressured to leave. Funny how some of those same officers ended up with cushy security jobs in Richardson's companies later on. Sarah tried to keep her voice steady. Why are you telling me this? Eleanor's expression softened. Because yesterday I saw Officer Bennett talking to some men in an unmarked car outside your house. And this morning, someone was taking pictures of your property from across the street. I may be old, dear, but I know trouble when I see it. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She hadn't noticed anyone taking pictures. Max pressed against her leg, a gesture of reassurance that helped steady her nerves. Be careful, Sarah, Eleanor said quietly. This neighborhood has secrets that some people would prefer stayed buried. With that, she turned and walked back to her house, leaving Sarah with a growing sense of unease. That evening, Sarah sent a carefully worded email to James, relating Eleanor's warnings without including any specific details. His response came quickly. Time to put some contingency plans in place. Meet tomorrow, usual spot. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah found herself checking and rechecking the locks on her doors and windows. Max followed her through the house, his own inspection even more thorough than usual. When they finally settled for the night, he positioned himself not in his bed but directly in front of her bedroom door. Sarah lay awake, Eleanor's words echoing in her mind. The Richardson case wasn't just about fraud. It was about power, about the ability to reshape entire neighborhoods through money and influence. And somewhere in that web of corruption, Max had stumbled upon evidence that threatened to unravel it all. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief. What Detective Martinez didn't tell you. Check the date of the mountain training exercise. Compare it to Richardson's court date. Not a coincidence. Sarah's hands shook as she deleted the message. Max lifted his head, watching her with those knowing eyes. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that was both clearer and more dangerous than she'd imagined. Tomorrow, she would meet with James and start working on those contingency plans. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of her bedroom, Sarah finally understood what Christina had meant about Max being living proof. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance, he was a deliberate target, removed from the picture at a very specific moment. The question now wasn't just about what had happened 3 years ago, it was about what might happen next, now that Max had resurfaced, and the truth was beginning to emerge. Outside, a car drove slowly past her house, its headlights sweeping across her bedroom windows. Max stood, moving silently to the window to watch. Sarah didn't need to look to know it wasn't a normal patrol car. The quiet life she'd rebuilt with Max was changing, transforming into something more complicated and potentially dangerous. But as she watched her loyal companion standing guard, Sarah felt a strange mix of fear and determination. They had uncovered this truth together, and together they would face whatever came next. The peaceful routine of their Cherry Creek life might be disturbed, but the bond between them had never been stronger. The morning sun had barely risen over the Rockies when Sarah loaded a small duffel bag into her car. Following James's instructions, she had packed only essentials: clothes, basic toiletries, and Max's food and supplies. Her important documents were secured in a waterproof pouch, along with the burner phone James had provided. "Just temporary," she whispered to Max as they pulled out of the driveway. "Until we figure this out." Max sat in his usual spot, but his posture was rigid, professional. More Maximus the police dog than the gentle companion she'd adopted. They met James at a small ranch property outside of Golden, owned by his sister Kate Morrison. The property sat at the end of a long dirt road, with clear views in all directions. perfect for spotting unwanted visitors. Kate Morrison proved to be as practical and direct as her brother. "The guest house is yours for as long as you need it," she said, leading them across the well-maintained grounds. "I've got security cameras covering the whole property, and my neighbors know to call if they spot any unusual vehicles." The guest house was small but comfortable, with large windows offering panoramic views of the surrounding countryside. Max immediately began a thorough inspection of the space, moving from room to room with methodical precision. "He remembers his training," Kate observed, watching Max work. "James told me about his background. Must have been quite a shock when you found out." Sarah nodded, setting down her bag. "Sometimes I think he was trying to tell me all along. The way he always positioned himself, how he monitored our surroundings. I just didn't know how to read the signs." "Police dogs don't forget their training," Kate said. "But they also don't form the kind of bond he has with you unless they choose to. Whatever happened to him, he chose you as much as you chose him." After Kate left, Sarah spent the afternoon settling into the guest house while James made some calls. Max alternated between patrolling the perimeter and staying close to Sarah, his behavior shifting seamlessly between vigilant guard dog and affectionate companion. Around sunset, James returned with news. "I talked to my contact at the Denver Post. She's been investigating Richardson's recent development projects. Turns out he's planning something big in Cherry Creek, buying up entire blocks through shell companies. The same pattern he used before." "Eleanor mentioned something about that," Sarah said, "about how he pressured people to sell their homes years ago." "Yeah, but this is different. The properties he's targeting now, they form a perfect circle around the warehouse where Max found those documents 3 years ago." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "You think there's still evidence there?" "Christina thinks so. That's why she's been—" James was cut off by Max's sudden alert posture, his attention fixed on the window. Moments later, they heard the crunch of tires on the dirt road. Kate appeared at the door. "Just my neighbor's truck," she reported, "but Max caught it before my cameras did. He's something special." That evening, as Sarah prepared for bed in the unfamiliar space, she found herself grateful for Max's steady presence. He had positioned himself near the bedroom door, as had become his habit, but something about his demeanor had shifted since they'd arrived at the ranch. "You feel it too, don't you?" she asked him. "We're getting closer to the truth." Max's ears twitched at her voice, but his attention remained focused on his surroundings. In the days since their meeting with Christina, his police training had become more evident. It was as if each new revelation about his past brought more of Maximus to the surface, while still maintaining the gentle spirit of the Max she'd come to love. Sarah's phone buzzed, another message from the unknown number. "Richardson's development plan goes to City Council next week. Final approval expected. Once it passes, the warehouse comes down. Clock is ticking." A soft whine from Max drew her attention. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her heart ache. In that moment, Sarah realized they were at a crossroads. They could stay hidden at the ranch, safe but inactive, or they could take action before the evidence was lost forever. "What do you think, boy?" she asked, knowing the answer before she finished the question. Max's posture straightened, his bearing almost regal. He wasn't just her companion anymore, he was her partner, and they had a job to do. Sarah reached for her phone to text James, but before she could, headlights swept across the guest house windows. Max was instantly alert, a low growl building in his throat. This wasn't Kate's neighbor. The headlights cut off, leaving them in darkness. Sarah could hear car doors opening, followed by the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. Max moved silently to position himself between her and the door, his training taking over completely. Sarah's hand closed around the burner phone as she backed away from the window. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The quiet life they'd built in Cherry Creek seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by something more dangerous but also more purposeful. As she dialed James's number, Sarah realized that this moment had been inevitable since the day she'd adopted Max. They weren't just a woman and her rescue dog anymore. They were the keepers of a truth that powerful people wanted to remain hidden, and their time for playing it safe was running out. The next few seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. Sarah could hear James's phone ringing in the distance as Max maintained his protective stance, ears forward, every muscle tense. The footsteps outside had stopped, but the silence was somehow more threatening than noise would have been. Suddenly, Max's posture shifted, His growl subsided, replaced by a subtle tail wag. Moments later, Kate's voice came through the darkness. "Sarah, it's us. Sorry about the stealth approach. We spotted a tail on the main road." Sarah released the breath she'd been holding as Kate and James entered, accompanied by a tall woman she didn't recognize. Max's behavior was fascinating. He maintained his alert status, but showed no signs of concern about the newcomer. "This is Rachel Thompson," James said, securing the door behind them. "She's my contact at the Denver Post, and she's been doing some serious digging into the Richardson development plans." Rachel set her laptop bag on the kitchen table. "And I found something interesting, very interesting." She pulled out her computer and several folders. "But first, we need to talk about what happened tonight." Kate moved to the windows, checking the property's security cameras on her tablet. 2 vehicles followed Rachel from Denver. They turned back when they realized she was heading to my ranch, but they'll be watching the main roads now. "They're getting nervous," Rachel said, opening her laptop. "And I think I know why. Look at this." She pulled up a series of documents and satellite images. These are the original plans for Richardson's Cherry Creek development from 3 years ago, before the fraud investigation. "And these are the new plans submitted last month." Sarah leaned in, studying the images. "They look almost identical." "Almost," Rachel agreed, "except for one key difference. The warehouse where Max found the documents. In the old plans, it was scheduled for immediate demolition. In the new plans, it's being preserved as a historic structure, at least until all the surrounding properties are acquired." James whistled softly. "They're using the development project as cover to clean up their loose ends." "Exactly," Rachel nodded. "Once they own everything around it, they can demolish the warehouse without anyone asking questions. Any evidence still hidden there would be lost in the rubble." Max had moved to Sarah's side, his eyes fixed on the laptop screen. Sarah noticed something familiar in the satellite image. "That section of the warehouse, it's where Max found the hidden room, isn't it?" "According to Christina's notes, yes." Rachel pulled up another document. "And here's where it gets really interesting. The building's original blueprints show something that's not in the current plans, a series of underground storage rooms, part of the building's original use as a cold storage facility in the 1950s. The perfect place to hide documents," James mused. "Temperature-controlled, hidden from view. And Max found a way in," Sarah finished, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "That's why they had to get rid of him. He could have found other hidden rooms, other evidence." Kate returned from her security check. "Speaking of evidence, Christina sent word. Her FBI contact is ready to move, but they need probable cause for a warrant. They can't use Max's original discovery because of the tainted warrant from 3 years ago. So we need new evidence," Sarah said slowly, looking down at Max. "And we might know exactly where to find it." Rachel closed her laptop. "The city council votes on the development plan in 5 days. Once it's approved, Richardson's demolition permits will be fast-tracked. Then we have 5 days to find a legal way into that warehouse," James stated. "But with Richardson's people watching both of you now, it won't be easy." Sarah felt Max press against her leg, his solid presence grounding her racing thoughts. "What about Eleanor Wright? She mentioned something about the original Cherry Creek development, about families being pressured to sell. If she has documentation from back then, it could establish a pattern," Rachel finished excitedly. "Enough for the FBI to justify a new search warrant. But we'd need to talk to her without alerting Richardson's people." "I might have an idea about that," Kate said, "but it's going to require perfect timing and Max's special skills." As they began to plan, Sarah watched Max's reactions. His police training was fully evident now, his attention shifting between the speakers, processing information just as he must have done during briefings in his previous life. But when their eyes met, she saw the same trust and devotion that had drawn her to him at the shelter. They were no longer just trying to uncover what had happened 3 years ago. They were working to prevent history from repeating itself, to stop more families from being pressured out of their homes, to expose the corruption that had tried to silence both Max and Christina. Outside, the Colorado night was still and clear, the stars brilliant above the ranch. Sarah knew that somewhere out there, Richardson's people were watching, waiting. The comfortable life she'd built with Max seemed like it belonged to someone else now. But as she looked around the room at their unlikely team, a journalist, a service dog trainer, a ranch owner and a former police dog, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Max shifted slightly, alert to something only he could sense. Sarah laid her hand on his back, feeling the steady strength beneath his fur. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The truth about his past had brought them to this moment, but it was their future that they were fighting for now. The pre-dawn light barely illuminated the quiet streets of Cherry Creek as Sarah's car approached Eleanor Wright's house. The neighborhood looked different in the gray morning light, more vulnerable somehow, as if the approaching sunrise would reveal all its secrets. Kate's plan was simple, but clever. Sarah would appear to be returning home to pick up more clothes, giving her a natural reason to stop and chat with Eleanor. Meanwhile, James and Rachel would monitor Richardson's people, who had maintained their surveillance of Sarah's house. Max sat in the passenger seat, more alert than she'd ever seen him. They'd done several practice runs at the ranch, and he understood his role perfectly. As they passed Sarah's house, she noted the unmarked car parked 2 doors down, Richardson's watchers, right where James said they'd be. Eleanor was already in her garden, just as Kate had predicted, based on the elderly woman's clockwork routine. Sarah pulled into her own driveway, then walked to the fence with Max at her side. "Eleanor, you're up early," Sarah called out, keeping her voice casual despite her racing heart. The older woman looked up from her roses, understanding flickering in her eyes. "Sarah, dear, I was hoping you'd come back." She glanced meaningfully at her back door. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." Inside Eleanor's immaculate home, Sarah was struck by the walls of filing cabinets and carefully organized boxes. Eleanor hadn't just witnessed Cherry Creek's history, she'd documented it. "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions," Eleanor said, pulling out a thick folder. 30 years as a high school history teacher taught me the importance of keeping records. The folder contained newspaper clippings, letters, and photographs dating back to Richardson's first Cherry Creek development. Eleanor had documented everything: the sudden pressure on homeowners to sell, the mysterious accidents that plagued holdouts, the police reports that went nowhere. "But this," Eleanor said, pulling out a yellowed envelope, "this is what you really need to see. My late husband was a structural engineer. He inspected that warehouse before Richardson bought it. His original survey shows something interesting about those underground storage rooms." Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The technical drawings inside were detailed and precise, showing not just the storage rooms that Rachel had discovered, but something more. A secondary entrance hidden behind what appeared to be a solid wall. The cold storage facility needed a backup exit for safety reasons, Eleanor explained. When Richardson converted the building, that entrance was sealed off and disguised, but the structure is still there. And according to these plans, it connects directly to the room where your Max found those documents. Max's ears perked up at the mention of the warehouse. Sarah could almost see him remembering that day 3 years ago, when he'd tracked the scent of hidden papers through the building's maze-like interior. "Eleanor, these documents, they're exactly what we need, but sharing them might put you at risk." The older woman straightened in her chair. "Dear, I'm 83 years old. I've watched Richardson and his kind try to bully and buy their way through this neighborhood for decades. It's time someone stood up to them." Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from James. "2 more cars just joined the watchers. They know you're back. Wrap it up." "They're watching my house," Sarah said, worry creeping into her voice. Eleanor smiled slyly. "Well then, it's a good thing I have a back gate that leads to the alley, isn't it? Been here since before Richardson was born, just like me." As if on cue, Max moved to the back door, his posture indicating the route was clear. Sarah carefully packed the documents into her bag. "Eleanor, I can't thank you enough. Just promise me one thing," the older woman said, walking them to the back door. "When this is all over, bring Max by for a proper visit. That dog of yours, he reminds me of the good ones, from back when police officers served the community, not the highest bidder." In the alley behind Eleanor's house, Sarah and Max moved quickly but calmly, following the route they'd planned. James would be waiting 3 blocks away, ready to take the documents to Christina's FBI contact. The morning joggers and early commuters paid them no attention, just another resident walking her dog. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Rachel confirmed. Richardson called an emergency meeting. They're moving up the demolition timeline. Whatever we're going to do, it has to be today. Max's pace quickened slightly, matching Sarah's increasing urgency. The documents in her bag felt like they were burning a hole through the fabric. They weren't just pieces of paper, they were proof of a decades-long pattern of corruption and intimidation. As they approached the meeting point, Sarah saw James's truck idling exactly where it should be. Everything was going according to plan, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Max felt it too. His movements were precise, his attention constantly scanning their surroundings. They were committed now. The quiet life they'd built together had led them to this moment, and there would be no going back. But looking down at Max, seeing the sense of purpose in his bearing, Sarah knew they were doing the right thing. The sun was fully up now, painting Cherry Creek in morning light. Somewhere in the neighborhood, Richardson's people were probably just discovering that she'd slipped through their surveillance. Time was running out, but for the first time since this all began, Sarah felt like they might actually succeed. Max pressed against her leg, his familiar gesture of support. They had the evidence they needed, but the hardest part was still to come. The warehouse waited for them, holding its secrets in those hidden underground rooms. And this time, when Max led the way to the truth, it would be with the full force of the law behind him. The warehouse loomed before them in the late afternoon sun, its weathered brick facade hiding decades of secrets. Sarah stood with Christina and the FBI team, watching as Max underwent a brief reacquaintance with his old K9 equipment. The protective vest fit him perfectly, as if the intervening years had never happened. "The warrant's solid," Christina assured her. "Eleanor's documents, combined with the original blueprints and Richardson's demolition plans, gave us everything we needed. We can search every inch of this place." FBI Special Agent Laura Chen, who had been quietly coordinating with Christina for months, stepped forward. "Our team is in position. Once we breach the hidden entrance, we'll need Max to lead us to any documentation. His previous track record makes him our best shot at finding evidence before Richardson's people can respond." Sarah knelt beside Max, who sat at perfect attention in his K9 vest. "What do you think, boy? Ready to finish what you started 3 years ago?" Max's response was subtle but clear, the slight straightening of his posture, the focused intensity in his eyes. He wasn't just ready, he had been waiting for this moment since the day Sarah adopted him. The operation moved with precision. While one team secured the main entrance, Sarah followed Agent Chen and Christina to the hidden access point Eleanor's documents had revealed. The entrance was exactly where the old blueprints indicated, concealed behind what appeared to be a solid wall. "Richardson's people will be monitoring the main entrance," Christina explained, as the FBI team worked to expose the hidden door. "But they don't know about this. Eleanor's husband's documentation never made it into the official records." The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage leading down into darkness. Max moved forward confidently, his training taking over completely. Sarah felt a surge of pride watching him work. This was who he had been all along, a dedicated professional who had never lost his sense of purpose. The underground storage area was a maze of interconnected rooms, the air cool and dry. Max moved with purpose, leading them through the darkness with unwavering certainty. Sarah realized he wasn't just remembering his previous visit. He was actively tracking something. "He's got a scent," Christina whispered, recognizing the behavior from their years working together. Just like last time. Max led them to what appeared to be a solid wall at the back of one of the storage rooms. He indicated a spot near the floor, the same signal he had used 3 years ago when he discovered the hidden room. The FBI team moved quickly, revealing another concealed door. Behind it, they found what they were looking for: boxes of documents, hard drives, and most importantly, a logbook detailing years of payoffs and threats. "This goes way beyond real estate fraud," Agent Chen said, examining the records. "These are receipts for bribes, blackmail evidence, documentation of illegal surveillance. Richardson wasn't just building an empire, he was building a leverage machine." Suddenly, Max's posture changed. His ears pricked forward, body tensing. Moments later, they heard the commotion upstairs. Richardson's people had arrived. "We need to move," Christina urged. "They'll try to come in through the main entrance," but she was cut off by the sound of footsteps in the passage behind them. Max moved to position himself between Sarah and the approaching threat, his protective instincts perfectly balancing with his professional training. Agent Chen spoke quietly into her radio, and within moments the underground space was swarming with FBI agents. The evidence was quickly secured, and the approaching footsteps retreated, their owners realizing they were too late. As they emerged from the warehouse, Sarah saw Thomas Richardson himself standing across the street, watching as FBI agents carried box after box of evidence from his hidden archive. His face showed no emotion, but his clenched fists betrayed his fury. Officer Bennett was there too, being led away in handcuffs. The logbook had revealed his role in Max's disappearance. He had been paid to sabotage the K9 unit's equipment and ensure Max couldn't return to expose what he had found. Max stood proudly beside Sarah, his bearing that of a professional who had completed his mission. When Christina approached him, her eyes shining with tears of pride, he finally allowed his formal demeanor to soften, greeting his former partner with genuine affection. "He never lost his training," Christina said to Sarah. "He just needed the right person to help him use it again." As the FBI continued their work, Sarah found herself looking at the warehouse with new eyes. This building, which had held so many secrets, had brought her and Max together in ways she never could have imagined. Their quiet life in Cherry Creek had transformed into something extraordinary, but their bond had only grown stronger. Agent Chen approached them, her expression serious but satisfied. "We'll need both of you to give statements, but it can wait until tomorrow. What you and Max did today, it's going to change a lot of lives for the better." Sarah felt Max press against her leg, his familiar gesture of support now carrying new meaning. He wasn't just her loyal companion or a former police dog, he was both, and so much more. Together, they had uncovered the truth, protected their community, and found a purpose greater than either of them had expected. The sun was setting over Denver, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Cherry Creek would change now. Richardson's influence would fade and the neighborhood would have a chance to heal, but some things wouldn't change at all. Max looked up at her, his dark eyes full of the same trust and devotion she'd seen at the shelter. Tomorrow they would go back to their walks and quiet evenings together, but now they would do so knowing they had made a difference. They had turned their bond into something powerful enough to expose corruption and protect their community. As they walked to the car, Sarah knew that while their great adventure might be ending, their story was far from over. After all, every great partnership had to start somewhere, even if it began with a lonely woman and a mysterious shelter dog who turned out to be so much more than anyone expected. The following weeks brought more changes to Cherry Creek than the neighborhood had seen in decades. Richardson's arrest had made national headlines, and the exposure of his corruption network had sent shockwaves through Denver's political and business communities. But for Sarah and Max, life had settled into a new kind of normal. Their morning walks now included regular stops at Eleanor's house, where the elderly woman would share stories of the neighborhood's history with an ever-growing group of interested residents. The community that Richardson had tried to intimidate into silence was finding its voice again. "You know," Eleanor said one morning, watching Max play with the neighborhood children in her garden, "I always believed someone would finally expose the truth. I just never expected it to be a rescue dog and a widow who moved here looking for peace and quiet." Sarah smiled, watching Max expertly navigate between his roles as friendly companion and vigilant protector. "I don't think either of us expected any of this, but sometimes the best partnerships come from the most unexpected places." The Denver Police Department had undergone significant changes as well. With Officer Bennett and several other corrupted officers removed from service, Christina had been asked to return and help rebuild the K9 unit. She'd visited Sarah and Max several times, always with the same question. "The offer still stands," Christina said during her latest visit. "Max could be reinstated. His performance during the warehouse operation proved he hasn't lost any of his skills. The unit would be lucky to have him back." Sarah watched Max, who was lying at her feet but clearly listening to every word. "What do you think, boy? Want to go back to official duty?" Max's response was clear. He stood up, walked to Christina, and gave her an affectionate greeting, then returned to Sarah's side, pressing against her leg in his characteristic gesture of devotion. Christina laughed. "I thought as much. He's found his true calling, being exactly where he needs to be." The warehouse that had held so many secrets was being transformed as well. After the FBI finished processing all the evidence, the City Council had voted to turn the property into a community center. James Morrison had been asked to establish a training program there for service dogs and their handlers. "It feels right," James told Sarah, as they watched Max demonstrate proper leash etiquette for a group of new dog owners, taking a place that was used to hide corruption and turning it into somewhere that helps people and animals connect. Max was the inspiration for that, you know. Sarah did know. She'd seen how their story had inspired others in the community. Rachel's articles about Max had sparked a movement of people adopting older dogs from shelters. The Denver Animal Rescue Center had started a program to help match retired service dogs with compatible owners. But perhaps the most significant change had happened within Sarah herself. The quiet, withdrawn woman who had adopted Max hoping to ease her loneliness had found something she never expected: a purpose. Their bond had grown into something that touched not just their lives, but the lives of everyone around them. One evening, as they sat in their backyard watching the sunset paint the Rocky Mountains in brilliant colors, Sarah received a text from Agent Chen. Final count on Richardson's network: 23 corrupt officials exposed, $142 million in illegal profits recovered, and 156 families who will receive restitution for their lost properties. All because a brave dog refused to forget what he'd found, and a brave woman helped him finish what he started. Max lifted his head at the sound of Sarah's phone, his dark eyes meeting hers with that same understanding that had drawn them together at the shelter. He was still the highly trained K9 who had uncovered a web of corruption, but he was also the loyal companion who had helped her find her strength again. "We did good, didn't we?" she whispered, scratching behind his ears. Max's tail thumped against the ground in agreement. Their quiet life hadn't turned out quite the way Sarah had expected, but it had become something far more meaningful. They had not only uncovered the truth, but had helped create positive change in their community. The sun dipped below the mountains, and Max stood up, ready for their evening walk. Some things hadn't changed. They still had their routines, their quiet moments together. But now they walked with the confidence of those who had faced challenges and emerged stronger. As they set out into the cool evening air, Sarah noticed how the neighborhood felt different. Families were out on their porches, children played in their yards, and neighbors stopped to chat with each other. Cherry Creek was healing, becoming the community it was always meant to be. Max walked beside her, alternating between his professional alertness and his more relaxed companion mode. He had found the perfect balance between his past and present, just as Sarah had. Together, they had transformed their simple story of rescue and redemption into something that had helped rescue and redeem an entire community. 1 year later, Cherry Creek Park was transformed for a special celebration. Colorful banners hung between the trees, and rows of chairs faced a small podium. The occasion? The grand opening of the Cherry Creek Community Center and K9 training facility, housed in the renovated warehouse that had once held Richardson's secrets. Sarah sat in the front row, Max beside her in his dress K9 vest, a special gift from Christina for the occasion. Around them, familiar faces filled the crowd. Eleanor Wright, looking proud and dignified, James and Kate Morrison, who had become close friends, Rachel Thompson, her reporter's notebook at the ready, and Agent Chen, representing the FBI. Christina took the podium, her police uniform gleaming in the morning sun. 1 year ago, this building stood as a symbol of corruption and greed. Today, we reclaim it as a place of hope and new beginnings. None of this would have been possible without the extraordinary partnership between a remarkable dog and the woman who gave him a second chance. As Christina spoke about the new training facility and its programs, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The warehouse that had once held evidence of Richardson's crimes would now help train the next generation of service dogs. The underground rooms that had hidden documents would be used to teach search and rescue techniques. James's training program had already placed 15 service dogs with veterans and individuals with disabilities. Kate had established a sanctuary at her ranch for retired police and military dogs. Rachel's articles had inspired similar programs in other cities. And now, Christina announced, I'd like to introduce our first graduating class of community K9 teams. Sarah watched as 5 handlers and their dogs walked onto the stage. Each pair had a unique story: a veteran with PTSD and his support dog, a former shelter volunteer and her search and rescue trainee, a retired police officer working with a promising young tracking dog. Max watched the ceremony with perfect attention, his bearing professional but proud. When the new teams demonstrated their skills, His tail wagged slightly, the expert appreciating promising students. After the ceremony, as people mingled and enjoyed refreshments, Eleanor made her way to Sarah. "You know, dear, when you first moved to Cherry Creek, I worried you might be too quiet, too removed from the community. I never imagined you and Max would end up changing all our lives." Sarah looked around at the gathering. Richardson's influence had been replaced by something stronger, a community that looked out for each other. The neighborhood children played freely again, their parents no longer worried about mysterious accidents or anonymous threats. "Max changed my life first," Sarah replied, watching as her dog graciously accepted attention from some of the children. "Everything else just followed naturally." Christina joined them, carrying a special plaque that would hang in the facility's entrance. It bore a photo of Max in his original K9 vest, along with the words, "In honor of Maximus, who never forgot his duty," and Sarah Mitchell, who helped him fulfill it. Their partnership reminds us that second chances can change not just 2 lives, but an entire community. As the day wound down, Sarah and Max took a walk through the park. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the path. They passed the spot where they'd first met James, the bench where they'd sat countless times during their early morning walks, the playground where Max had first shown his protective instincts toward the neighborhood children. Max walked with his characteristic grace, still alert and professional, but also relaxed and content. He had found his perfect role, part guardian, part companion, all heart. His past as Maximus the police dog, and his present as Max the beloved companion, had merged into something unique and wonderful. They stopped at their favorite viewpoint, looking out over the city toward the mountains. Sarah thought about the lonely widow who had walked into the Denver Animal Rescue Center hoping to find a quiet companion. Instead, she'd found a partner, a purpose, and a new kind of family. Max pressed against her leg, and Sarah knew he was thinking of that day too. Their eyes met with the deep understanding that had grown between them, an understanding that went beyond words, beyond the ordinary bonds between human and dog. They had uncovered corruption, yes, and helped bring justice to their community. But more importantly, they had shown that second chances, when given with an open heart, could lead to extraordinary things. Their story had started with a simple adoption, but had grown into something that would continue to touch lives for years to come. As the sun set over Denver, Sarah and Max turned toward home. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, they were content in the knowledge that they had found exactly where they belonged, with each other, in a community they had helped heal, living a life that was anything but quiet. Max's tail wagged gently as they walked, matching the rhythm of their steps. They were more than guardian and companion, more than partners in justice. They were proof that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism start with a simple act of love, and that the strongest bonds are formed when 2 hearts recognize in each other exactly what they need.